Today I'll be talking, we'll depart from fish for a moment, and we'll talk about Hawaii's endangered waterbirds and how science that we're conducting on refuges is aiding management and recovery of these species across the landscape. So this talk is actually a compilation of about 6 different presentations and covers 6 different projects. And so I'm going to touch only on portions of each of these projects and be kind of light on the methods. I'd like to acknowledge my many co-authors who I've collaborated with on these projects over the last couple years. So Hawaii's endangered endemic waterbirds consist of the Hawaiian coot, the Hawaiian duck, the Hawaiian stilt, the Hawaiian gallinule featured here, which are all obligate wetland birds, and then the Hawaiian goose, which is uses the Hawaiian wetlands but also can survive in habitats, a variety of habitats all the way up to the tops of the volcanoes. Over the last several decades, 6 national wildlife refuges have been designated in Hawaii specifically for the recovery and protection of these endangered Hawaiian waterbirds, and they're spread throughout the main Hawaiian Islands. And on refuges, we use an active management strategy for the conservation of these waterbirds. It consists of 3 main tenets: control introduced plants, control introduced predators, and then manage the water so that it mimics a more natural hydrologic regime for the birds. So the overarching question that spans all these projects is, how are we doing? Are we being effective in our management efforts? Are we recovering these species? And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to look at it through 3 different sections here. First, is this management strategy effective? And we'll look at that by looking at current population trends over the last couple decades. Then dive more specifically into the active management strategy and look at one of those main 3 tenets, which is the introduced predator control. And then lastly, we'll talk about the basic biology. To manage these birds, we really need to understand more of how they move around the landscape, and so I'll get into that in the end. So waterbird population trends were estimated using several sources of data. First, across Hawaii, twice a year, all wetlands are surveyed and the birds are censused in those wetlands. So we get a minimum population estimate for the state twice a year. And then on refuges, we do the same count, but we also do monthly counts to census the waterbirds. We're able to use those data to look at trends and also at seasonality across the state and on refuges, seasonal use of wetlands. And I'm going to be presenting data on the Hawaiian coot, stilt, and gallinule. The Hawaiian duck is considered to be hybridized on most of the islands with feral mallards, and so it's hard to tell in the field whether or not it's a hybrid or a Hawaiian duck, and so the count data for those are questionable. So I'm just going to jump right into the results. We found that over the last several decades, all 3 species have been either stable or increasing in population, both on refuges and off refuges. So that's good. I'll talk a little bit about why, but we noticed that actually the population trend was growing slightly faster off of refuges than on refuges. So another way we can assess whether or not the active management strategy we have are using on refuges is effective is by the number of birds using refuges versus other wetlands. So our refuges are some of the most managed wetlands for these waterbirds in the state, but they only consist of about 15% of the total available wetlands for the birds. However, when we look at the numbers of birds using the refuges, we find that 40 to 50% of the Hawaiian stilts, 30 to 40% of the Hawaiian gallinules, and 30 to 40% of the Hawaiian coots are on refuges at any given time. So this would suggest that there are much higher densities in these managed wetlands than in the unmanaged wetlands. So kind of to conclude this section, we found that all three species are either stable or increasing over the last several decades. This would suggest then that this active management strategy that we're using on refuges is effective, and this would be maybe a success for Hawaiian flora and fauna. We've seen some presentations where their trajectory is going down, the waterbirds appear to be going up. Active management is not just on refuges, so that may be why we're seeing population growth rates be as high or higher off of refuges. And another reason why we might be seeing higher population growth rates off refuges is that the refuges are small areas, like I showed, only 15%, and they've been managed for the last several decades in a similar fashion, and at some point then these wetlands get saturated with birds, and so birds are actually dispersing, birds produced on refuges are dispersing off refuge to other wetlands. And so we're seeing that, and possibly seeing that in why there's more birds off of refuges. So next I'm going to go into our control of introduced predators. So there are many, many introduced predators of these waterbirds in Hawaii. The main predators are the mammalian predators, cats, rats, and mongoose, and to a lesser degree dogs, pigs, barn owls, cattle egrets, bullfrog, predatory fish, pretty much everything. We use a variety of techniques to control them, including fences, live trapping, rodenticide bait stations. So how can we tell if we're being effective at this? Well, we can look both at the waterbird populations and we can look at the predator populations. So we can look at the waterbird densities. We would assume that if we're being effective, we'd see higher densities of birds on refuges in areas with predator control versus not. And we would expect to see higher reproductive success in areas with predator control. For the predator populations, we would expect to see lower abundances in the areas with predator control, and we can also look at how effective our control strategy is by looking at capture history. So to me, the most important thing for predator control is, are we being effective at producing offspring? One example we could look at is at Kealia Pond, where there were weekly nest surveys for stilt nests, where we looked at both reproductive success and then also the depredation rate. Now this is a good area for this kind of a comparison because each of these little red dots here is a nest, but we only have predator control in one portion of the refuge. So this is all the same year. So we can compare this area that has predator control, the success of the nests there, to these other nests here, which were also monitored but do not have predator control. So we found that the nest success in the areas with predator control here were higher than in the areas with no predator control, and that the depredation rate was lower than in the areas with no predator control. So this is kind of a busy graph, but I want you to focus on the plus and the minus. So this is the densities of waterbirds, so numbers of birds per hectare. We found that in the wetlands with predator control, we had much higher densities of these waterbirds than in the areas with no predator control. Now, these wetlands are all considered to be core wetlands in the recovery plan for the waterbird. So it's not like we cherry-picked wetlands here that some are less important. So in order to be recovered, all of these wetlands should be being managed for waterbirds. So next we'll look at the mammalian predator control, specifically cats, rats, mongoose, and rodents. Now, this is an example from James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge. The Ki'i unit of James Campbell is actively managed for predators, and we kind of employ this strategy of stop them at the gate. So we kind of ring the managed area with traps and bait stations, and then we have some on the interior as well to catch any who get through. So is this an effective control strategy? Well, if we capture more individuals along the perimeter than in the interior, then we would argue that that is an effective strategy. And in fact, when we do that, when we look at capture histories of each trap and then interpolate that across the landscape, reds are more captures, blue or less capture. We can see here that kind of what we would hope is that we would have far fewer captures of animals inside the managed wetland than along the perimeter. So another way to look at this is through the abundance of the predators, and we can do that for mongoose and rodents through track tunnels. Track tunnels are little black boxes that you put a card inside that has ink, and then in the middle you put some bait, and then the rodents or mongoose come in to eat the bait. They get ink on their paws, and then as they go out, they leave tracks. And so you can look at the presence or absence of these predators in an area by the number of tracks on cards. So we did this comparison looking at an area here. This is that same area where we had the predator control, the Ki'i unit on James Campbell, and then Punamano here is another unit of the refuge that does not have predator control. We did the same kind of analysis where we looked at the presence of this, in this example, mongoose in the track tunnels, and we can see here again the same pattern where there's many more individuals, the red, along the perimeter than in the interior where it's blue. So good, that's what we want to see. When we compare it to the relative abundance to the area without predator control, again you see this area without predator control, we see many more, a much higher relative abundance of mongoose compared to the entire area here where we have predator control. Now this also allows us to assess our control strategy, having these two. So this again is the capture history. We see that the lowest kind of number of captures were along this side of the managed area next to the dunes. But when we look at the track tunnel results, we see that the highest number of mongoose are along this side of the managed area in the dunes. So what does that mean? Well, that means that probably the traps in that area might not be working. Maybe we need more traps. Something's happening because we have many more mongoose out here and we're catching far fewer. So another predator, especially of the chicks, is the American bullfrog, which was introduced in the 1800s to Hawaii, mostly as a food source. And the manager this is our current kind of trap that we use to trap bullfrogs. It's kind of a fish-style funnel trap with a piece of red flagging here in the middle that's the attractant for the bullfrogs. And the manager had a question, is this an effective attractant? So we tried to do this a simple scientific study here where we gridded up this, again this is in James Campbell in that Ki'i unit. We gridded up the shoreline of the ponds into 10-meter squares, which is about the size of a bullfrog territory. And then we randomly selected, we selected 2 ponds and randomly selected 15 sites around those ponds. And then to each of those, we randomly assigned one of 3 treatments. We did a pilot study where we looked at the red flagging and a lifelike bullfrog decoy as an attractant, and then compared that to a control of no attractant. And we did this for 3 trapping sessions, and we essentially found no difference. We were catching the same number of frogs in all 3 traps. So we decided that we would try to find something that maybe be more effective than the red flagging or the lifelike bullfrog decoy. So we tried bullfrog calls played on an MP3 player, light, and then our control. Now we did this over 9 trapping sessions of a week. And again, for each of these treatments, we had 5 traps that had the treatment in it. And we found that the calls were significantly more effective at catching animals than the control. However, that effectiveness decreased over time. So the longer a trap was in an area, the fewer frogs we caught. Now that may not be surprising. Bullfrogs are territorial. You hear somebody calling in your territory, you're going to go over and investigate it. And when we looked at sex versus the attractant, we found that the calls were significantly better at catching male bullfrogs, but the same was not true for female bullfrogs. So for this, we found that calls are likely a more effective attractant, but we should be moving the traps around to be most effective, and that red flagging probably isn't any better than nothing. So last, in my 1 minute I have left, I'm going to talk about the the movement. To best manage these birds, we need to know how they're moving both around wetlands on an island and between islands. To do this, we use several different techniques. We used banding, telemetry, and also genetics. We put 8 satellite transmitters on Hawaiian coots. We put 28 transmitters on both Hawaiian coots, stilts, and gallinules. And then we set up these kind of base stations of antennas that would collect presence of the bird's radio signal without us needing to be there. And then we banded 200 plus birds and took 150 genetic samples, either feathers or blood. And this is results for the coots and the satellite transmitters. These were all trapped on James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge, outlined here. And they all pretty much stayed on the refuge. And I could show this same graph for 7 of the 8 birds. So I'll skip to the one that did something different. And it went all the way to the next door neighbors where there's a golf course for a couple months, and then it came back. This is an example from the telemetry data. A complete bar here signifies that it was in an area the whole day. Each color here is a different location. And if there's a blank space, that means in a day, then that means we didn't have, it went somewhere where we didn't have an antenna array. So you can see here that stilts mostly, again, kind of stay in the same wetland, but they do move around. We do see that almost all of them moved to different wetlands. Lastly here, an example from our genetics research. Here's looking at the microsatellites of the gallinule. We found that each population, even though all on the same island, had different genetic structure, signifying that there's probably very little movement between these populations. And that was kind of corroborated by our banding resites. We found that coots had a moderate level of movement between wetlands in the same island, but very little movement between islands, although they did appear on each of the different individual islands. But for gallinules, we only had 1 bird that moved to a close approximate wetland and no inter-island movement. So this is still an ongoing project, but so far we've figured out that stilts kind of do move around, have a moderate level of movement both between islands and around the island. Coots have that kind of moderate intra-island movement, but not inter-island. And then the moorhens or gallinules really don't move at all. And I'd like to acknowledge everyone else who helped with these projects. And I have 1 minute for questions.
All right, thanks, Jerry.
I'm just wondering, in the dune habitat, are there seabirds nesting to be kind of attracting predators?
In that area of the dunes, we haven't documented any nesting. In the future, potentially, but not right now.
How about the abundance of wetlands themselves off refuge? Has there been any work? I know the JV is working feverishly on improving wetlands conservation. Any change in wetland abundance off refuge?
So there may be wetlands. Actually, Hawaii hasn't lost as many of its wetlands as the mainland has. I think they estimate about 30% reduction from historic times. But what's happened is these invasive plants have basically filled in wetlands, rendering them useless to the waterbirds by and large. So we get large, like California grass. I don't know if you guys have that here or not, but it basically fills in wetlands in a matter of months. And in Hawaii, we have a year-round growing season. So if you're not out there managing those plants continuously, then in a matter of months, a wetland can fill in. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Jared.